Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, well, it's certainly been an eventful several days. Of course, across the country, people are still shoveling out roads and sidewalks from the dramatic snow flaw we had. And of course, many of us have struggled to get back to work because of disrupted flights. Some parts of Texas, believe it or not, had as many as 10 inches of snow. I know that's not a big deal in the great state of Nebraska, but it's a big deal in Texas because Texans cannot drive on the snow and ice. I think that's anybody who's seen some of the video of people trying to drive on the ice in Texas, we're not used to that. But a severe snowstorm was not the only thing to hit our country over the last weekend. As we all know too well, an ICU nurse for the VA named Alex Pretti was killed in an interaction with Border Patrol agents in Minneapolis. We are still learning more about what transpired that day. But unfortunately, what we see too often when tragic events like this occur is people jump to conclusions early without knowing all the facts. But regardless of what we don't yet know, what we do know is that it's always a tragedy when a human life is ended. I applaud President Trump for taking the steps to review this and sending Tom Homan into Minneapolis to try to de-escalate and restore law and order in that state. The president's also indicated he talked to Governor Walz and that they're working toward a productive solution into what has become an untenable state of affairs in Minneapolis. One thing's absolutely clear: we need better collaboration and cooperation, maybe a little more cooperation than collaboration, between federal and law enforcement in order to ensure that our laws are being followed while preventing further loss of life in our country. But when state and local officials like the governor and the mayor of Minneapolis use their position of authority to vilify federal law enforcement officials, bad things can happen. The governor of Minnesota has compared federal agents to a modern-day Gestapo. How reprehensible and irresponsible is that, particularly coming from a guy who wanted to be the Vice President of the United States? And obviously, Governor Newsom in California has used similar language. Governor Walz has described his state as fighting a war against the federal government. And he called the Trump administration's enforcement operations dangerous and sensationalized. I'll tell you what makes situations like that happened in Minneapolis 2 times now, where American citizens have lost their lives. What makes that more likely to happen is when governors and mayors, people who are supposedly in positions of responsibility, actually encourage people to interfere with law enforcement operations. And we know that now, on at least 2 occasions, they can end with tragic results. This is completely unacceptable conduct by a governor and a mayor. What they should do is stop their sanctuary policies. We don't see the same sort of law enforcement operations in Texas or Nebraska. We see it in sanctuary states and sanctuary cities where local and state law enforcement are denied the chance to collaborate and cooperate with federal law enforcement authorities. What happens in states like Texas that does cooperate with law enforcement is when somebody is detained, let's say by the police in the local jail, if they find out they are wanted by ICE, they will simply transfer them from the local jurisdiction to the custody of ICE, so that ICE doesn't have to go out on the street and conduct raids in order to detain people who are not lawfully here in the United States. All this may seem like fun and games to blue state governors and sanctuary city mayors until somebody gets hurt. But now, as I said, 2 people have tragically lost their lives. And we have the governor and the mayor cheering people on to do more of the same. This has to de-escalate. And I'm optimistic that Tom Homan, given his long career as a professional law enforcement officer, somebody applauded by President Obama for his work, but obviously who also has the confidence of President Trump. I'm glad he is there in Minneapolis talking to the mayor, talking to the governor, hopefully trying to get them to tone down the rhetoric and not encourage more actions which could also result in tragedy. While we're waiting to learn more details, yes, still waiting to learn more details about what exactly happened, I believe state and local officials have an obligation to tone down their rhetoric. Because what they are doing is they're vilifying the brave men and women who actually are enforcing laws that Congress has passed. They're calling them Nazis or the Gestapo. Of course, maybe you should expect this from the same crowd that called for defunding the police. How did that work out? Or abolishing ICE. Abolish ICE? Are these people who want no enforcement of our immigration laws? Well, apparently so. ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and Customs and Border Protection officers that I know personally and know of by reputation have an incredibly difficult and dangerous job to do, especially in the face of well-organized and paid-off left-wing agitators. But again, underlying all of this are the sanctuary city policies implemented by Governor Walz and others that have prevented law enforcement officials from conducting their work in a safe and orderly fashion. Well, we've seen what happens when the local police are instructed not to protect ICE officers and Border Patrol agents doing their job, as happened in Chicago, and ordinary citizens have been encouraged to interfere with law enforcement operations. The incendiary rhetoric from the governor encouraged ordinary citizens to put themselves into harm's way. Ultimately, the confrontations between citizens and law enforcement culminated in last week's incident that ended in tragedy. And I sincerely hope, I know we all do, that this does not happen again. None of us want to see lives lost, whether at the hands of law enforcement or at the hands of criminals. What happened to Alex Pretti was tragic. But we also need to remind people what happened to Laken Riley, Kayla Hamilton, Jocelyn Nungare, that what happened to them was also tragic and could have been prevented. Their deaths could have been prevented if the immigration laws currently on the books had simply been enforced. Each of them were killed by people who had no business being in this country illegally and committed these murders because of the Biden administration's open border policies that just opened the door to anybody and everybody that wanted to come to the United States. That's what sensible enforcement of our immigration laws is designed to prevent. To allow people into the country who play by the books, play by the rules, and follow the law, who we welcome into this country. The United States still is the most generous country in the world when it comes to welcoming immigrants. We naturalize roughly 1 million people a year who raise their hand and pledge allegiance to the United States and their willingness to support the Constitution and laws of this great country. Legal immigration is a great boom and great advantage the United States has, but illegal immigration has been an unmitigated disaster. You know, as I think back on the Biden era of open borders, what breaks my heart is the fact that 500,000 children were welcomed into the United States, so-called unaccompanied minors, placed with sponsors, frequently unvetted and without adequate supervision or follow-up, and were simply lost. We don't know whether they were recruited into gangs, used for sex trafficking, forced into involuntary labor. Those 500,000 children were victims of this open border, lawless immigration policy of the Biden administration. President Trump was elected based on a promise to secure the border, which he has done. But we also need to make sure that people who've exhausted all of their legal remedies or have criminal records need to be prioritized and removed from the country. And right now, there are roughly 280,000 people who are in that category. But to have the governor and the mayor encourage people to interfere in a lawful enforcement operation can result in tragedy, as we've seen. Well, Mr. President, we now know that these two tragedies are being exploited by Democrats in the Senate who refuse to pass the normal appropriations bills that have now passed the House and have come here in order to pay the bills, keep the lights on, and keep the government operational. And they're using these incidents to threaten another closure, another shutdown of the federal government, like they did a short time ago with the longest shutdown in American history. Democrats are using this tragedy as a scapegoat to try to force changes to government funding that they know cannot be done in the time we have left before the current continuing resolution expires. This is nothing but an excuse, a lame excuse by Senate Democrats to delay and disrupt the work that the American people elected us to do. We know that Senate Democrats have used this playbook recently, and the American people have seen how it ends. It solves nothing. When the government reopens, you have the same problems you had beforehand that you just are ignoring or kicking the can down the road. And it imposes an unnecessary burden on so many Americans who don't get paid, who get furloughed, and created not only financial hardship for millions of Americans, but this was all for what? To simply make a political statement. But I hope, for the sake of the Texans I represent, the 32 million Texans, that Democrats have learned something from their recent lesson about using their livelihoods, holding their livelihood as a hostage for political purposes. This is not the time for another government shutdown. In order for President Trump to continue the work he started to restore trust between local and federal officials in Minnesota, the Department of Homeland Security, and yes, that includes ICE and Border Patrol, must be funded. We can have conversations about what additional oversight is required, what additional laws we should consider, but not at the expense of shutting down the government. Again, what happened over the weekend was a tragedy, but it's not a reason to punish 330 million Americans by shutting down the government as a political stunt. Mr. President, I yield the floor.